Welcome everyone to this occasion where we celebrate the life and work of Dr Rosemary Stewart, a fellow in Organisational Behaviour at Green Templeton College, who passed away in the summer of 2015. Welcome in particular Professor Ewan James, Rosemary's husband, and her close friends and family in the audience. It is my pleasure to say a few words about Rosemary's work and her contribution more generally to management studies at Oxford, before I introduce the author and social philosopher Charles Handy, who will deliver the inaugural lecture in her name. My name is Sue Dobson. I'm a professor here at the Business School and also Associate Dean for Faculty. I also have a very personal connection to Rosemary. She gave me my first research job at Oxford some 30 years ago. I was, of course, only 12 at the time, but it was her mentorship, actually, and her friendship, and her very, very warm personality over many years that shaped my own career. Rosemary became the first female management don at Oxford, as she was appointed Fellow in Organisational Behaviour in 1966. Her thinking about the nature of management work was influenced from the late 1960s by her work delivering executive education at the Oxford Centre for Management Studies, later renamed Templeton College. Looking at her work, one can see how her studies have built on each other. Interviewing managers for her work at the Acton Society made her realise how different jobs were, and that hierarchical level only accounted for some of these differences. She started to make sense of these observations and developed a model for understanding these differences, describing it as demands, constraints, and choices. This model informed her teaching and leadership development work over many years, and it helps and continues to help individual managers examine their conception of the job and the distinctive ways they are doing it, as well as helping them explore the choices in their work. Rosemary employed robust and detailed research methods, for example, asking managers to keep detailed diaries and collecting data to analyse carefully the allocation of their most precious resource, time. Managerial work was her focus, and with Henry Mintzberg at McGill, she simply owned this field. Rosemary has had a profound impact on leadership thinking in the field of healthcare. Her many studies of NHS leaders were hugely influential in NHS leadership development, but also in health policy. Her understanding of the problems managers in the NHS faced was enhanced by a small periodic workshop that she ran for general managers and subsequently chairs. Rosemary fully understood that leadership is a very, very lonely activity, and she facilitated many confidential workshops, enabling those attending to make real progress in their leadership work. I finally want to turn to Rosemary's impact on the development of management studies at Oxford. The university celebrated 50 years of management studies in the summer last year, 3 weeks before Rosemary's passing. The Vice-Chancellor reflected on the vision, resilience and business acumen of the first group of fellows in the Oxford Centre of Management Studies as they coaxed a reluctant university to establish degrees in management studies and delivered a significant income stream from executive education that was key to the establishment of Saïd Business School as a full-service business school. Stephen Barclay, who's here today, son of the founder of OCMS, said of Rosemary, "Without her stature and authority in the business school world 50 years ago, it would have been a much harder task for OCMS to have had any credibility at all." And in this way, Rosemary's scholarship and work, as well as her personality, played a crucial part in the story of management studies in Oxford. Rosemary's work, spanning 5 decades, stands as testimony to the benefits of a truly cumulative and programmatic research effort, focused on systematically exploring phenomena layer by layer, nuance by nuance. Her research methods were and remain innovative, exhaustive and cutting edge. Commentators on her work have spoken of there being something for everyone in Rosemary's research. And there is one very clear piece of advice from Rosemary's work. Reconsider your demands and constraints, and you may well see that you have more choice in your circumstances than you initially perceived, and you will be more effective as a consequence. We miss her very dearly, but it is wonderful that we have this opportunity to celebrate her life and work together. And it is my great pleasure then to introduce Charles Handy to give the inaugural lecture in Rosemary's name. Charles is well known to all of us here. He has been described as a business guru and is regularly rated amongst the Thinkers 50. Charles specialises in the future of work, human capital and management. His work has a continuing and profound impact on organisational studies and on the world of policy and practice. And what's very special about Charles agreeing to give this lecture is there's a very personal connection, which I know you're going to talk about as well. So we thank you very much indeed for giving your time, and thanks everybody else for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. It's a real honour and a privilege to be here and to talk about Rosemary and a few other things after that. Elizabeth and I, my wife here, knew Rosemary and Ewan we've known them for a long time. And I just wanted to take you through some photographs from our family album. This is from quite a long time ago in Ewan's garden. You will see that little girl there with her back to you. She's going to be 50 next week, so you can tell how long ago that was. Ewan told me at the time that mathematicians think better lying on their back in the sun. So he's at work. So life goes on and on and on and on. And this was the last meeting we had with Rosemary. If you notice, she hasn't really changed through all those times. Body a little more bent, but the brain's still fuzzing away, eyes still sparkling right to the end. It was a great privilege to know both of them. But tonight, it's not Ewan, it's Rosemary we're talking about. I had a fantastic admiration for this woman. You know, when I came back from MIT, where I was struggling to learn a little about organizations and so on, I came back to start the first proper executive program called the Sloan Program at the New London Business School. And I knew nothing really about organizations or how to run them or whatever. This was the mid-60s. There were some people, distinguished scholars in Britain at the time, writing about organizations, but they all came from sociological departments. So they talked about the tribes that were organizations. Rosemary seemed to have spotted a gap in the market. How did you make these places work? What was the management of them? Who and what was the manager? She set out to find out. She interviewed 1,500 managers to find out what they did. And in a subsequent book, she interviewed another 450 managers to find out what they did and to explain it to the world and subsequently to managers themselves to help them understand what their job was. I could not emulate that. 1,500 interviews. After 3, I get bored. She was the perfect scholar, the perfect researcher. I just was lost in admiration. I just don't have the discipline, the patience, and I'm far too opinionated. I tell stories, I dream, and hopefully that's different in another way. But I certainly couldn't not emulate this fantastic scholar who was actually, I think, in the search of truth, or what she would call reality. And her great book, of course, was The Reality of Management, read 3 editions, I think. Amazing, went through her life. Now, what's going to happen is I'm going to talk for another 25 minutes, and then we're going to have the empty chair process. Let me explain. Rather than questions and answers from the audience, which means whoever asks you a question has his back to half of the audience, and it's not very acceptable. And I want to have a conversation with anybody who's interested in taking part. So I'm going to sit in the middle here of these 3 chairs when I finish talking. And I'm going to invite people to come and have a conversation with me, first on my left, and that leaves the chair on my right empty. As soon as somebody comes and sits on that chair, I'll finish my conversation with this person and turn to this person. And that leaves that chair empty if that person leaves the seat. And so we go on with a rolling conversation in front of you. The conversation can be a question. It can be a comment. You are talking nonsense. In my experience, that does not happen like that, or whatever. It is a conversation, not a question and answer, unless you so wanted. Okay? And that will stop at 6:10. Okay? So, let me start with one of my stories. Today is St. Patrick's Day. As a Dubliner, born in Dublin, I should be back there today. But to my pleasure and privilege, I'm here. But years ago, on St. Patrick's Day, I was there, and I was driving through the little hills and mountains behind Dublin. I don't know if you've ever been there. They're very beautiful, but they're very bare, and in those days, they didn't put any signposts up because we were supposed to know the way. It's a small country. Of course, I didn't. I got lost. I saw a man by the side of the road, so I said to him, I'm not sure if I'm on the right road to Avoca, am I? Oh, indeed you are, sir, he said. You just go straight on up this hill, quite a long way, and then over the top, and going down, you'll see Davy's Bar at the bottom, beyond a little bridge over a stream. You got that? You can't miss it, he said, because it's painted red. Do you understand? Have you got it? I said, yeah, I think so, up the long hill and then down Davy's Bar. Right, he said. Well, 1 kilometre before you get that, turn right up the hill. Well, that seemed clear enough in a way, so I drove off, and of course I passed a road and then another road, and then I got to Davy's Bar. So I turned around and came back and took the road nearest to Davy's Bar and went on my way. It all worked. But then I thought, you can't do that in life. You know, you can't turn back once you've gone past. There's the paradox of progress. You don't know the way to the future until you've gone past it. So I came back and I put that on paper. And this is the road to Davy's Bar. Or in my view now, this line of everything that is human. Everything that is human, your life, your organization, your government, your empire, your country, starts with a pain that things go down because you need to invest in anything to get it going. It may be money, it may be experiment, it may be education. You have to invest before you go up. And then you go up, and that's grand. But everything peaks out at some point, and it goes down and reaches Davy's Bar at the end of that line. And I'm sorry, all you can do now is mark on that line where you are, where your organization is, where this school is, where Oxford University is, where the hospitals are, and then wonder. And that's very depressing, particularly since that line seems to be moving faster and faster these days. Excuse me. But there's hope. There's hope. There is a line up the hill. There is a second curve. And that sounds rather obvious. And it's just a gimmicky way of saying you've got to reinvent yourself. But it's more subtle than that. You will note the second curve always has to start before the first curve peaks, in order that you have the resources and the time to invest in the beginning of the second curve. The problem is that point is at the moment when you are actually feeling most satisfied with what you're doing, when everything seems to be going very well indeed. And everybody says, steady as you go. The status quo has to be the way forward. And yet that is the very moment when you should be thinking of something different. Now you have time, because in my experience, whether you're an individual or an organization or a government, you have 2 years to fill that gap. 2 years until the first curve begins to go down and the second curve begins to go up. But it's very important to keep the first curve going in order to finance the start of the second curve. The great danger is that you leave it too late. And then if you took out a pencil and paper and tried to draw the start of the second curve when you're halfway down the road to Davy's Bar, you can't do it. It doesn't go up enough. It doesn't go up enough. And this is the great strategic challenge for our organizations, and for you. Are you feeling so happy at the moment that it is the moment to start planning the next curve? Some people do it very well. Steve Jobs may have been an impossible man to live with or even to work with, but my God, he knew about second curve. Every time a product was doing very well, he jumped to another one in a different market. Alex Ferguson, another world. Very good. Just when his players were peaking, he sold them off to somebody else and find another one. Giving him time to build up. He made one mistake. He resigned 2 years too late, just when things were passing the peak. So his successor, poor chap, Terry Leahy in Tesco, resigned too late and left Philip Clark with a terrible job of an organization going down the hill to Davy's Bar. I think succession problems can be well explained by my second curve dilemma. So it happens all the time. So people will say to me, well, how on earth do you know where that line should start until you've gone past it? And the answer is, you don't. You don't. But complacency is one side. Or a trigger. I have a trigger here, my wife. As she says to me every 10 years, you're getting very boring. And so we have to change. More difficult in organizations, but therefore, I started writing this book, which takes this principle and looks at various bits of our society, because my view of a lot of British society, and indeed I think it applies to most countries, is that most of our institutions and our ways of doing things are stuck in the previous century or even the century before last. Our government, our parliament, our schools, our hospitals, our health service, all these things were invented 100 years ago, 50, 70 years ago, whatever, and I think they need a second curve. Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to make it happen. As I say in the book, we probably need a dictatorship. But in the book, I look at all these aspects and suggest some incredibly, apparently radical alternatives. But it's really saying to people, please, please, think differently. This country and Europe as a whole is going downhill if you're not careful. It really needs a second curve. What that second curve will be is not really up to me. I make some provocative suggestions, but you will all have different ones. It's just to make you think. It's not a prescriptive. It's a provocation. Now, I want to spend now a little time just talking about what's happening to our work and through our work, our lives, leaving the other bits for you to read if you ever wanted to buy the book. So I think what's happening to our workplace is fairly dramatic. I think we have been living in what I call the caterpillar age. Caterpillars, as you probably know, only know one thing in life, that they have to grow as big as they can, as fast as they can. And that is the way our organizations have typically been behaving. I don't just mean our businesses, I mean all organizations. Grow, grow, grow seems to be the mantra. Because if we grow, we give people more opportunities, etc., etc. We get more clout in the world, etc. So let us grow. But as you know, caterpillars mutate into butterflies when they reach a certain size. What they discover, but they don't know in advance. We know. The problem is the caterpillar does not know that he's going to be a butterfly. What he does know is that at a certain stage, he begins to sort of build a new kind of skin around himself, and he gets all kind of liquid inside, and he mutates, and out eventually comes the butterfly. And I think we are moving from the age of the caterpillar to the age of the butterfly. What do I mean about the age of the butterfly? Well, there are lots of examples, but let me just pick the most obvious one, which you'll all know about, which is Uber. Now, if you think not just Uber, but think eBay, think Google, think Facebook, think Airbnb, think all of these new organizations from what's called cognitive capitalism. None of them have any customers, and none of them have any products, and they have very few staff. Facebook, as you know, has more users, 1.6 billion, more users than the population of China. And he has 9,000 staff. They can all fit in to one small campus in California. Extraordinary. Mm-hmm. Google has no customers. It has no product. It has mechanisms facilitating other people. They are enabling organizations. They enable others to do things. They enable others to connect with customers, with other organizations, with friends, with whatever. They enable other people to do things. It's quite a different concept of an organization. Now, we think, well, that's fine. These are the, flotsam and jetsam of the new age. It's interesting and it's fun, isn't it? But it doesn't apply to us. We run serious organizations. I'm suggesting to you that it does matter to you. Because this idea of a platform or a portal, or even just a website, if you like to put it that way, that allows individuals to connect with other individuals or with other bits of an organization without any intervening person or layer of management, is very interesting. And as organizations gradually discover what it means, those who swathes of people in the middle who are basically supervising what other people do or feeding information to other people below and around them will not be necessary anymore. Just a typical small example from the voluntary world. There's an organization called Kiva, which is in the microfinance business in Africa. Mm-hmm. Now, normally in the microfinance, they go around collecting money from all of you, and then they dish it out to women, typically women in the villages, to start little businesses. And what Kiva does is slightly different. They do have staff on the ground in Africa identifying the women who are about to start a little business, who could do with a loan or a grant. And they put them on their website. And then you as an individual can pick and choose which ones that you would like to finance. And you give the money to them directly. Mm-hmm. And the people on the ground out in Africa will make sure that the loan is repaid and so on. But, there's nobody in England supervising or intervening. It's just you direct to the person. Mm-hmm. It's a sort of platform, a real platform. And so it goes on. Everything can, in a sense, be Uberized. Now. So, for instance, whole institutions and collections of institutions may eventually wither away. Do we need banks anymore? We already have peer-to-peer lending. Mm-hmm. A young friend of mine was unemployed the other day for a short time. He decided to make a bid for the Times through crowdfunding. The press got a little interested. Within 2 weeks, he had £400,000 collected. Well, people offering that. Then the press lost interest. He didn't get any further. But, he got nearly £500,000 to buy the Times, starting with nothing and with no name and no reputation and no organization. Mm-hmm. I said he could have bought the Independent. Yes. But then he'd have to run it, of course, which is another matter, But but we get slightly irresponsible behavior that's possible. Anybody can do anything. In the book, I call it the DIY economy. You can do anything for yourself. In fact, increasingly, you will have to. One of the results that's happening is that everybody is having to become, in effect, self-employed. Not everybody, but more and more people. The government is, proud to say that we are creating more jobs. Well, it's a different sort of job. Another story. I was talking with, counseling with, a man in his late 40s, early 50s, who'd just been made redundant from his advertising business, his advertising firm. And he was lamenting the fact that it was such an ageist industry that they weren't employing people like him just because he was getting close to 50. He said, there are no jobs for me, and it's absolutely disgraceful. Just at that moment, the electrician who'd been working in our house popped his nose around my door and he said, sorry, I've got to go off now. I'll be back tomorrow. I've got another job to go to. I said, that's a new meaning of job. It doesn't mean a role in an organization. It means a customer. It means a project. So when the government says more and more jobs are being created, actually they're electrician-type jobs, self-employment type jobs for the most part. Now, most of those jobs may not be very well paid. So people are actually putting together in what I long ago called a portfolio. So they do a bit of Ubering, a bit of Airbnb, they do a bit of sort of retailing on eBay. Last thing I heard, if you want to make money, go into retail. What you do, you've got an empty garage, well, take the car out, you've got an empty garage. Go on Alibaba, that's a big online department store in China. You use it as a wholesaler, find what you want, buy it in bulk from Alibaba, it'll be delivered within a week to your garage. Then, okay, sell it off locally in small chunks at double the price. You're in retail. Now, anybody can do that. I'll give you the Alibaba site, it's alibaba.com, and you're away. So, also, this is the way the world is going. Now, how does that apply to organizations that will still exist? We will still have caterpillars around, thank God, because we need them. Partly because that's where you learn about business, that's where you learn about management, that's where Rosemary's books begin to be useful to everybody because they tell you how to do that job. And if Rosemary was here, she'd be running a workshop on just how to do the manager's job. And I, in a Bowderized way, long ago took Rosemary's model of constraints, demands, and choices and said, actually, it's a donut. I'm going to enlarge on that just in a second, but just to explain. The donut is an English donut, so the jam is in the middle. It's not a bagel, not an empty middle. And the jam is what you have to do. That's the demand. That's the core of your work. If you don't do it, you have failed. And of course, there's a ring around it, which is your constraints. You can't spend more money than your budget allows you or whatever. You can't go beyond the health and safety rules and whatever. But in between, there's all the dough. And that's your area of discretion, your choice, if you like, as Rosemary would call it. Now, Rosemary said that's the job of a manager. I'm saying you can look at every group in an organization that way. A group has something that it needs to do and has constraints, but it also should have discretion. The great trouble with the caterpillar organizations is they design groups with very little discretion because they don't trust them. Most organizations of the caterpillar variety would like to run organizations like the train timetable, so that they can tell precisely which train is due at which station at which time. They do not want the train driver to use his discretion and leave out some stations. In fact, some drivers have been doing this in the southern region recently. They've been leaving out a few stations to get there on time. And people have got cross for some reason. I mean, he's using their initiative, but, You're not supposed to do that in caterpillar organizations. I'm saying in the new organizations, you're going to have to let people do that. Because basically, you could design the whole organization around independent, autonomous donuts, groups, with relative freedom to do what they want, provided you give them the resources. So instead of having silos in your organization, with lots of specialities who never communicate with each other, you put all the required facilities in there and leave them to communicate with whoever they want, customers or... Do you know the Haier Corporation in China? It's the largest manufacturer of white goods in the world. Haier, H-A-I-E-R, run by an extraordinary chap called Zhang Rumin. Now, Zhang Rumin, they did employ 70,000 people. Now they employ 60,000 people as though they've doubled in size. And how have they done that? Because they've got rid of a lot of the, what you might call in most organizations, the overhead. And he has created 2,000 semi-autonomous groups in the organization, none of them more than about 100 people strong. And they have a lot of freedom to design their work and so on. And he's now gone one step further, and he said to 200 of them, you can actually be a little business. You can go out and tout for your own customers, you can innovate, and you can keep the money you make. And he's doubled in size and reduced his staff. Because basically he's created a great big platform where people can actually communicate on their own with whomever they want to, create their own customers through this platform. Now, I'm suggesting that even the existing caterpillars, whether you're a hospital, whether you're a school, whether you're a bunch of schools, whether you're a business and whatever, you will eventually move to this platform model where people can communicate on their own, and it's self-regulating, rather like Uber, because you feedback all the time whether you've got satisfactory responses at either end. So, you know, it's amazing. I mean, when Jeff Skoll, who many of you here will know because of the Skoll Forum, when Jeff Skoll was appointed, when he was a young man as first chief operating officer of eBay, he could not believe this idea that people would actually trust each other to pay the money. But because of the feedback system was built in, eBay worked. Jeff got enormously rich. The Skoll Forum has got rich, all because you can actually trust people if there's mutual feedback. So you can trust strangers. Extraordinary. And this is going to go more and more. And all of your organizations in future, one day, will effectively be a platform with lots of independent bodies or individuals coordinating by themselves without the middle ranks. You know, the estimates range whether 35% of jobs will go or 50% of jobs will go in the next 20 years, but they'll be organizational type jobs. They will be replaced by my electrician type jobs, in my view. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge for the people to educate people. It's a challenge for the government. How are they going to collect taxes? You know, self-employed people don't pay taxes, either because they don't want to, or because they don't need to, or it's very difficult. I mean, they should fill in these tax returns, shouldn't they? But they never get around to it, and then they forget to declare this bit of money and that bit of money. I mean, it's a big problem. How are we going to finance the country when 40% of the people are self-employed, which I predict will happen within the next 20 years? Is the government thinking about that? No. Shouldn't the government read my book? Yes. Shouldn't you read the book? Of course. But you want to not read the book because you just heard me tell you what it's all about? Of course. I'm now going to sit down, because you've had enough waffle from me, and we got 25 minutes, when I hope we can continue this conversation about anything you like. Some what I've said, what I have not said, why my ideas don't work in your organization, why you hope they don't work, whatever. So please, can I have maybe Sue, you could be the first one. Come on my left here.
So Charles, you've given, certainly when you were talking, I was beginning to reflect on the business school, actually. Andrew and I are involved in leadership positions here, and I think I recognise that comfortable feeling.
Yeah.
And I guess I'd like to have some advice about business schools. If you could reinvent them, what do they need to really think about and look like? And then a second question, if I may, it's related, is what role do business schools have in helping organisations reinvent themselves?
Well, I could, put another
All right.
20 minutes, yes.
There you go.
I would, a rival university in London is starting a business school, King's College. And the two ladies there, who are the dean and the associate dean, came to see me the other day. One of the questions they said, if your grandchild, not my daughter anymore, if your granddaughter was going into business, would you suggest she goes to a business school? And I said no. Because I don't think you learn about management in a classroom. I think you can reflect on management in a room, which hopefully is not a classroom, because you can reflect with other people and with some help, but it'll probably be a smaller room around a circular table. And you will have had quite a lot of experience of trying to manage before you do that. So I gave a talk to all the deans most of the deans of European business schools last year in Brussels, in which I predicted that half of the business schools today would be not there in 10 years' time, or at least their MBA programs would not be there. I think it's the MBA programs that will beat the dust first. I think executive education, wrong term, executive reflection will grow. I think we will have, I hope, much more future-based research rather than looking back at how other companies have done things. I think companies need help in planning their future, not looking at what you do basically in business schools, in my experience, is you study the past, or you study current best practice, and then you repeat it through case studies or so-called research. And actually, I think you really want much more, well, research in action almost, working with organizations to discover new ways, for instance, to insert a platform into it and bringing that kind of thing back. So my second curve would basically get rid of the MBA model and forget about degrees. I know it's not going to happen, you see, because MBAs are your cash cow, and concentrate on what I call executive reflection. But the problem, as always with these things, is that the first curve is your cash cow curve, whatever organization you're in, and you're very reluctant to do anything that damages. And I do say you have to continue it for 2 years while you're building up the new thing. But in the end, you have to discard it. And that plays havoc with your financial models. And this is always the problem. You know, we were talking earlier with Andrew here that, you know, all the best intentions in the world go for a burden because the sort of bottom line comes in. So that's the problem. I have an empty chair here, so I hope somebody will come but thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you.
And now there's an empty chair here, but while I have a conversation with, tell me your name?
My name is Jonathan Trevor. I'm Associate Professor of Management Practice here at
Oh, my
Saïd
goodness.
School. I know, very grand.
An expert. Yeah.
No, not at all. Thank you very much for an excellent talk. Thank you. The issue that I'd like to discuss is the metaphor with the caterpillar and indeed the butterfly. And you imply that in future there's almost a transition, which is one way, from being a caterpillar to a butterfly. Is that absolutely the case? Is it not the case that we will have both butterflies and caterpillars? And indeed, perhaps, is there even a third way where we have something in the middle? organisations that are trying to do both, be both efficient and flexible or innovative? And what does that look like?
Yes, I think it's quite possible that, I mean, you could conceive, I have to get rid of the metaphor in a way, but you could conceive of a collection of mini caterpillars, as it were, in a lot of butterflies inside an organizational framework. Or you can think of a world in which some butterflies go off and become gazelles, as they call them, successful mini businesses, which actually in turn become caterpillars. I mean, nature is a strange thing, isn't it? But, so you will have a mix. Certainly, you'll have a mix in society, but you could have a mix within one big organization. Like, suppose if you keep the caterpillars small, the trouble is the caterpillar culture tends to squash the butterfly culture. I used to talk about elephants and fleas, but the elephants don't turn into fleas, and caterpillars do turn into butterflies. I mean, what's happening now? I mean, just to give you another story, if I may. By the way, when you feel like it, come and sit. Somebody rang me up from New York, who is the recruitment officer for a big consultancy, and he said, we've had a very good recruitment session this year. We've got some wonderful people, you know, that we've identified. And as you know, we are a very good employer. Problem, none of them seem to come and want to work for us. And I said, are you surprised? I mean, the best people don't want to work for a big organization at all, however famous you are. I said, think about a new model for your organization. Think of it as a university. Think of people coming here and you offer them 5 years, where they can learn lots of things, but even they're very smart, they still need to know a few tricks and trades of the business. And then if they graduate, if you think they're any good, you push them out. Keep 20% of the equity and a seat on the board so that you're giving them some money and some help, and then let them fly. They're butterflies. But they'll enrich you and they'll spread your reputation. He said, interesting, he said, we'll think about it. English for go stuff yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
Hello. And you?
I'm Sandy Mackay. I'm an architect, but I did the strategic leadership course at Templeton about 25 years ago. Now, I'm interested because if you look at the construction industry, it used to be a caterpillar, very large organizations in the 60s. It then became lots of small organizations, rather like your model from China. But the problem with that is, how do you actually do something large with an organization that's broken up? The problem in the construction industry now is that you've got lots of men in white vans who actually build the building. They're subcontracted from subcontractors, who are subcontracted to main contractors, and each level takes a proportion of the profit.
Yeah.
It then makes it very expensive to build because everybody's carrying their own risk, carrying their own insurance, trying to take a cut of the profit, and it's very difficult. We're now moving towards a collaborative environment, and I just wondered on your thoughts on collaboration as a way forward.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, but I'm saying it'll happen through platforms in a way. In other words, I think some of the levels of subcontracting will be eased out, really, because they won't be needed. And in other words, the smaller people, the end people who actually build it, will be able to come in direct. And because you'll give them public feedback, as it were, and they'll give you public feedback, like an eBay thing, you get some built-in quality control. But it's never going to be easy to do these huge contracts. But I think you'll be able to see on your website, as it were, how it's all fitting together. At least eventually, it's going to take the technology some time to make it easy for you to do that.
But you still need a very large investment. If you look at the machines that are used for laying track and crossrail, for example, you're looking at investment of several £1 million. Your company of 100 people hasn't got that sort of asset base. How do you actually create something large with a lot of very small people?
Well, you know, Facebook isn't short of investors. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't know how you actually collate all this into a significant kind of asset base, so that you could actually sell it to a funder in some way. And this again is where the technology has got to help you build us this kind of picture so that you can actually say this is a whole thing. But the law has got to keep pace with that too, and the law doesn't understand what's happening. I mean, we're in unexplored territory.
Yes, we're moving that way because we've now got integrated project insurances, so we've now got one insurance for the entire project, and that's a huge enabler. But it's still this question of where you actually find the funding. We haven't solved it. At the moment, the collaborative organisations are struggling to attract the funding. You're probably right that the platform or something.
Well, I think, I mean, the legal thing has to change quickly. I mean, again, you're trying to change the law. Yes. I mean, that's a caterpillar par excellence. You know, it's going to be very, very difficult, but it'll have to come because, you know, the people that you want in the end to do the work are available. And it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man or technology to find a way of getting them together in a collaborative format that could actually entice people to put some money into it. Yeah. So, good luck. Anyway, thank you. That's a very interesting example.
Hi. I'm kind of interested in the consequences of this future that you're painting, the types of organisations. Do you think they're the organisations that we... Do you think of the organisations that... It's not on?
It should have a red light.
It has a red light.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll start again.
Start again.
I'm interested in the future you're painting with these different new organisational forms and platforms and models, about who actually benefits from these, and are they the organisations that the society necessarily needs, and who are going to be the winners and losers in this world?
I think it's a very good question. People say to me sometimes, I don't like this world that you're advocating. And I say, no, I'm not advocating it. I don't like it at all, actually. But it's what's happening. I mean, for instance, where do you learn the trades? For instance, I mean, in the theatre world, we used to have repertory theatres where you learned how to act. They don't happen now. So where do you learn the skills? Okay, people, you know, grow little acting schools, but it's not the same thing as actually doing it and learning by doing it. We don't have that. So we have these big companies, but you know, there are no repertory companies feeding into them. One of the great virtues of the BBC was where you learned about broadcasting. Now the BBC disintegrates now under this model, and it will, one way or another, I promise you. So we'll have a collection of butterflies that are loosely grouped under something called the BBC. And where do you learn about broadcasting? Okay, somebody will grow up a school to teach you, but it'll be a fake school. Well, rather like business schools, I think, which are, you know, not a simulacrum of the real world. And so, yes, I'm dead worried. I'm dead worried about the people who were pushing out of our schools, 20% of whom can't read and write when they leave, or at least not adequately. How will they cope? Because in this funny world, you've got to be a self-starter. Nobody's going to be looking after you. When I started life, working life, I joined Shell. You know, they promised to look after me for 40 years. And they did, and I just didn't like it in the end. But I mean, you know, but in this new world I'm talking about, you're out for yourself. Nobody's actually going to mother you, and a lot of people are going to find it very frightening.
So what do you think the role of the state is?
Well, I agree. I think that the role of the state, of course, is to find endless apprenticeships in some way for these people. But they don't, you know, the apprenticeships require employers, and the employers don't want to take on these people because they're getting thinner and thinner. And so the state has basically to do their best to educate them in a different way than they do at the moment, to give them early experience in some way of self-reliance, of coordination, of cooperation. You know, at the moment, you know, you can't look at your neighbour's work, it's called cheating, but then you get into the real life, and that's what you've got to do. I think schools have to totally change, and that's very difficult because the teachers only know to do what they've been used to doing. So the problems are horrendous, and what worries me, okay, I'm looking at them and you're advising me to look at them, but I don't hear government looking at them at all. They hope it plonks along, and I'm worried that we'll end up in Davy's Bar as a country, as a continent, in fact. As you look at China, which is not a place I really want to live, but I mean they are reinventing everything. because they don't have this long history that they've got to get rid of. At least they do have a long history, but they got rid of it. Luckily, Mao did it for them. But so it's a real problem. Thank you for raising the bad side of the butterfly economy.
Hello, I'm Chris Westcott. I was formerly with the BBC, but I don't want to ask a question about the BBC. I'm now with the Policy Institute at King's in London, specialising in security and intelligence. So I wanted to ask you a question about your second curve and terrorism.
Wow.
It struck me that the reinvention that you described and the amorphous self-governing groups is a very good description of, we've seen it in the Mujahideen, then the Taliban, absolutely. And then Al-Qaeda, and now ISIS and Al-Shabaab. Just wondered if you'd had a chance to give any thought to the success, unfortunately, of those organisations and how it reflects your model.
Well, I'm afraid that they bought into my sort of model in a big way. I mean, the way they communicate across and seem to be able to organise themselves, much more rapidly and somehow or other finance themselves. I mean, maybe the architectural profession should look at how they're doing it. I don't know how they're doing it, but it seems in some way to be using the kind of platform model.
Yes.
And somehow they've got money, and somebody's financing them for some reason, and somehow they've managed to, within that model, to have some sort of discipline, which is also surprises me. So I think when you look at new models of organization, you're not going to find them within the existing organizations. You're going to find them in different kinds of worlds, like the new Chinese businesses, like the terrorist organizations. And you're absolutely right. We should study how they do it as models of organization.
I mean, it's interesting that people have openly discussed the so-called franchise model of Al-Qaeda, which is a strange sort of bringing together of two different...
That's right, absolutely. And how do they control that? I mean, how do they discipline it? I mean, I wish I knew. I mean, you've got a new future, actually, if you want it in a second curve, When in the new King's Business School, you're desperately needed, the organisation of terrorist groups as a model for the future. It'll be wonderful. Thank you.
Hi, Charles. I'm Anne Olivarius, and I was at Templeton, and Rosemary was one of my instructors, and she made a big difference in my life. I now run a multinational law firm, and what I'd like to ask is about human capital, because it's a tired question, but it's still a relevant question, and that's about what does your model and the second curve mean for women, and what is that going to do for this great class of people who still haven't achieved equality in this country or...
Oh, terrifying. They're going to leapfrog us. I really mean that. I mean, I think they have all the qualities for operating in this kind of more free-form world that men lack. Men like structures, it seems to me. I mean, I'm generalizing hugely. You're all different, of course. But most men like structures. They like objectives. They like knowing where they stand. They like knowing who they report to. They like knowing who reports to them. I mean, they like caterpillar organizations. Now, the new young men, less so. But the new young women, wow. I mean, they don't like all this trappings of structures and so on.
But may I say, what I notice with the younger generation coming up is that all the women who come to work in my law firm, they hire the great and the good, they've got fabulous educations, best of class across the world. They all come and they're all convinced they're going to take over the world and have a life of equality. And we know that it doesn't happen. So I'm really concerned about structures that aren't working now, and I hear... And I've read everything Charles has written over every year that I've known him, which is many years, and Elizabeth. And I'm wondering, what does this model mean? Because portfolio, careers, sure, women are really good at that increasingly. And doing their own businesses, sure, absolutely. But is it going to be a better world for them maybe in the future? Will they have more confidence? Will they achieve equality finally?
Yeah, because I think the structures are breaking down. and men won't be able to cope as well as women will cope with freer form structures and so on. I mean, my worry about these very classy women that you get is that they're very clever, but I'm not sure that they have what I see as the great feminine qualities of flexibility and initiative and carry and all the rest of it, you know, because that's been, creativity has been in a sense drilled out of them by their education. So I hope you might take in some badly educated women as well as your well-educated women. But I'm very optimistic. I mean, I look at in the sort of very creative organizations that I mumble with occasionally, you know, media and advertising and so on. It's the women who are trumping the men, not necessarily in the structures, but, you know, in the actual work. Now, I don't know about the law. It's a sort of retrograde profession structurally, I think. But
Fair enough.
I don't mean to be rude, but I don't mean bad, but it just is stuck inevitably in the past because it relies so much on case studies and so on and so forth. But you see, look at yourself. Goodness me. I mean, there you are, you see. Wonderful example. You're reforming the whole business, aren't you?
Well, we're trying to.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
thank you.
Hi, I'm Paul Farmilow. I work at BT and I was at the Strategic Leadership course about 10 years ago. But I think I first saw you speak in Bradford when you were first talking about portfolio lives, which seemed quite radical to me then. But my question really is about your point about the institutions being stuck in the 19th and 20th century. And well, I haven't read the book yet, but your idea of it needs provocation or it needs maybe a dictator, I wondered sadly whether it needs something much more radical. And certainly an idea that I've read is the thought that war, however awful, is the only sort of vehicle we've got in human society for actually structurally changing things. With the first war being leading to the, I guess, argued women's equality, and the second war leading to the welfare state. But humans are sort of in their nature get stuck in a complacent rut.
Well, I'm afraid you're right. I mean, I'm afraid you see the real progression, going back to my curves, is that in my experience, most big organizations, including governments and so on, don't change until they're really very close to Davy's bar, and then they panic. They say, this is not where we want to be, we have got to change. And that is dramatic, because then they really have to do very dramatic things. And so basically that's when revolution of some sort of happens. So if it's not going to get to that stage, one needs a crisis. Now the crisis could be war, it could be famine, I mean it could be a mass migration, which is possibly happening. It means a collapse of the established order. I mean, it's quite clear that things are not working. And the sooner that happens, the better, because the further down you go on that slope, the less resources you have. And we have a Chancellor of the Exchequer who's stripping out all our resources, so that when we do have to change, there won't be enough to boost the second curve. And I would love him to read my book, but he
needs. I mean,
he won't. But I mean, you know.
when I heard you speak in Bradford, I was working for IBM just before it declared the biggest loss in corporate history and nearly collapsed. But again, that was the only thing that shook it up. It was.
Well, I know. Well, I was with IBM before that, and I was saying, you know, you've got to change. And they said, oh, don't be silly, this is IBM. You know, we know how the world works.
Yeah.
We have big computers. We tell them. Thank you very much.
So my name's Sandy Pepper, and I'm a graduate of Consulting and Coaching for Change here at Templeton. That started a second curve for me, so I'm now a professor at the London School of Economics.
Oh, wow.
But I'm also a father, so here's my question. I have 3 sons. The eldest is 24 and is a history graduate from Oxford and is training to be an accountant and is quite happy being a caterpillar or working for a caterpillar.
Yeah, absolutely.
And my youngest son is studying English, also here at Oxford, and he doesn't at the moment want to think about what he's going to do.
Of course not. He's got too much fun.
My middle son is in his last year at university, and he's studying French, and he knows that he would like to be a butterfly, and he also knows that he doesn't want to go anywhere near a caterpillar in the meantime. So what advice should I give to my middle son about how he starts on the path to becoming a butterfly?
Well, butterflies don't know that they're going to be butterflies even more than caterpillars do, and there are no training schools for butterflies. The only thing is to fly, and try. And I said to my kids, I said, you know, for God's sake, don't get a job when you leave university or college in your 20s. Get a customer of some sort. And maybe you'll make mistakes and so on. It doesn't matter in your 20s, but don't get encumbered with responsibilities, children and that sort of stuff until you're 30, if possible, so that you are free to make mistakes, because you will make lots of mistakes, but you will also have a lot of fun, and you'll discover in the end what it is you're good at, because education may not have told you what you're good at. I have this other theory I've written about, and it's in the book, called golden seeds, that everybody has a golden seed, a particular talent or capability, and if only they could discover it, or somebody could discover it for them and water it, then they're off. But you don't know what it is, and schools don't bring it out unless you're lucky. And too many doctors are the sons of doctors and daughters of doctors, and they might have been something else, only they never got a chance to find out. So explore as possible, and take risks.
I shall tell him.
And have a benevolent father, because they may need rescuing at times. So.
Charles, I'm Dipesh Shah. I sit on the board of a number of caterpillars, but I first came across you, I think it was in 1989, when you were providing a bit of guidance to us in BP as to how we might become more agile. After you'd written about the learning organisation. And I also attended the leadership program at Templeton and admired and appreciated Rosemary's coaching. My question is this. I fully empathize with the model that you've identified. One of the biggest challenges that caterpillars have is knowing when to get off that curve.
Yeah.
And the 2-year lead time for most caterpillars is a very, very short lead
particularly
time.
if you're in the oil industry, yeah.
Not just oil, water, all
those
industries which require huge backbone infrastructure where the timescales for investment are inevitably very, very long. So I think you have a real challenge as leaders within the pack to get the organisation to nurture the kind of innovation that you're talking about, the butterfly syndrome. Do you have any guidance on the amount of research that you've done? Do you have any guidance as to how one creates the dynamic environment of that sort, so that you're able to cannibalize your own products and services? You're
absolutely right, but unfortunately I'm not Rosemary. I don't do diligent research, which I should do. I don't. And I was telling Sue before we started that when I was talking to the would-be heads of the new business school the King's College is setting up, our son came on the phone, who has been an actor and is now a sort of actor manager, and I said I told him what we were busy and what we were doing. He said, "Oh, tell them they only need 2 professors, a professor of common sense and a professor of kindness." and to some extent, I think I'd say the same to the big bosses. I mean, you set them free, with as far as you can. Some of them, young Turks in the organisation. Usually the second curve belongs to another generation. And they need the blessings of the first curve, which can only be done by the boss cats, you know, who says tolerate these young men. They may have some future, and then be kind to them. And don't put, allow them a lot of dough in their donuts so that they can experiment again, rather like I was saying to the son, But it's not easy because, when you're up at the top of these organizations, you're very concerned with keeping that curve going. Indeed. Which you have to do, but,
You've got to love it.
I'm glad. I'm just jolly glad I'm not running them, because I know what they ought to do, but I don't know how I could do it. I couldn't do it. That's why I'm a teacher, I suppose.
Thank you.
This has to be the last conversation, I'm afraid, and appropriately, it's with you.
So, my name's Andrew White, and I'm the Associate Dean for Executive Education here in the school. And so, Charles, I just wanted to thank you for this evening. It strikes me this is a very fitting inaugural lecture in memory of Rosemary. And I can't remember who was the academic that said there's nothing as useful as a good theory. And her understanding of demands, constraints, and choices seems to me to be, as ever, a useful theory. to think about some of these things. And I think you've given us a fresh perspective on how those demands are changing and what that means for constraints and what that means for choices. And I think the thing that really stays with me is that we don't know the point to change until we've passed it.
Yeah, true.
And I think if we have a responsibility as a school, if we are about leadership development, and so much of our work is that to really hold the question, is it possible to train people to understand when to start destroying things, breaking things down, and consciously doing that, rather than waiting for war, waiting for crises, waiting for things which cause harm. I think as the conversation you had with Mark illustrated, that we need to find a better way of doing it, as the speed of these things appear to be increasing.
If you know how to do that, I'd be very grateful.
I think there's an obligation on us as a school to, I think, hold that question.
Can I just say that I'm so glad to be here. You may not know, but when the Savoy group of businessmen way back in the early 60s pressured the government to create business schools, and they agreed to create two, they came to Oxford and Cambridge and said, would you like to have a business school? And both universities said, we are not a trade school, thank you very much. And so they went to London and Manchester. I must say, as an Oxford graduate, I would love to have brought the Sloan programme to Oxford rather than London. But sadly, that didn't happen. But, you know, sometimes it's best to be later into the party than early. So I'm delighted now, at last, to be sitting and standing in this school in Oxford.
Well,
so
thank you.
Lovely to be here.
We have a small token of our
appreciation thank you.
For you and Elizabeth.
That's very kind.
And that now closes the formal part of the evening. I'd like to invite you all to come upstairs, where we're going to have a drinks reception. So once again, Charles, thank you, and also thank you to you and to Sue as well this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you for this. Very much.